24 of June 1910, ALFA, the anonima Lombarda Fabbrica Automobili, was founded in Milan. Today, Alfa Romeo is celebrating its 110th anniversary. Welcome to the Alfa Romeo Museum in Arese, just outside Milan. The museum collects the cars, engines and artifacts, as well as the stories of the people, of the projects that have left their marks on these 110 years of history. A history that begins with the first vehicle, but also with the history of the Alfa Romeo logo. Legend has it that a young designer, named Romano Cattaneo, was waiting for the streetcar one morning, and he noticed the two symbols of Milano, the cross of the municipality and the biscione, the snake of the Visconti family. These two symbols were combined to create the Alfa Romeo emblem, which has remained mostly unchanged until today, but is also being the mirror of the company's made transformation. Year after year, small and big changes were made until it finally came to life in its present form. Before accessing the heart of the museum, note that one section is dedicated to the brand's aeronautical production. From the Angelo dei Bimbi, the children's angel, to the great engines produced during the Second World War. The museum is divided into three sections: Timeline, Bellezza and Speed. The Timeline section tells the story of Alfa Romeo as a company, the production plants, the people that contributed to make it great. But, above all, the cars. First among all, the 24 horsepower, the first automobile produced by the car maker in 1910, and then throughout all the subsequent periods, until present day. 110 years of history have gone by, years in which the world has changed, cars have changed, but Alfa Romeo has always been capable of evolving and reinventing itself to remain into the spotlight. The second section is entitled Bellezza, the only word that is never translated. Bellezza is the transformation of the shapes, it is car design, but it's also the beauty of the world seen from behind the wheel of an Alfa Romeo, as well as Alfa Romeo's role in the society. The 50s and the 60s mark the period in which Alfa Romeo starred in advertising, cinema and everyday life. But the Giulietta, the Italy's girlfriend, and the Giulia, designed by the wind, were also witnesses of an industrial dimension. The plants were producing at full capacity, and Alfa's cars were winning at the races. The third and most passionate section of the museum is dedicated to speed. This section describes the races, drivers, the major challenges, but also the performance, driving pleasure, and technological excellence that distinguish Alfa Romeo. Our journey begins with a section dedicated to the big races in between the two world wars, where the drivers were considered actual heroes. After World War II, the world is entirely new. While at the Portello plant, the Alfa Romeo of the future was being designed, the legendary Alfettas, with Nino Farina and Fangio, were winning the two first World Championships of the newborn Formula One series. These remain two of the most important victories of Alfa Romeo Hall of Fame. However, what makes this brand truly legendary are not only the famous victories, but also the impossible endeavors that triggered the public's passion. Racing is part of Alfa Romeo's DNA, regardless of a period, car or category. Sportness and speed are the fundamental values of Alfa Romeo. With more than 70 vehicles on permanent display, the museum's backstage is home to the rest of the collection. 200 vehicles, engines, models, equipment, as well as both famous and unknown stories of Alfa Romeo. This is an area that the passionate fans can visit on appointment. But it's also an operational area of the museum, where the vehicles are moved, maintained, and they give life to everyday museum activities. The true heart of the museum and of Alfa Romeo is the documentation center. Stretching over 6,000 linear meters, this historical archive collects documents and photographs and other materials that tell the famous and less known stories of this brand. The documentation center is at the service of scholars, students and collectors. This, the museum, the collection, the archive, is where our journey through 110 years of Alfa Romeo history begins. The last section of the museum is Speed. It is a place in which the atmosphere, the noise of the races penetrate into the museum. These sections display the victories, the heroes behind the wheel, the legendary challenges, but also the sportness, performance and driving pleasure. It is a place in which all the cars are red, Alfa Red.
A Legend is Born tells the story of the great feats of this brand until the Second World War, an adventure that began with the victory of Ugo Sivocci's RL at the Targa Florio in 1923, and which saw the debut of the symbol of the four-leaf clover.
In 1925, the GP Tipo P2 won the first World Championship for Grand Prix vehicles. It was a revolutionary car which launched the era of Vittorio Jano. 2 liters, 8-cylinder, and for the first time a volumetric compressor, a technology that would make Alfa Romeo great in the 30s. The legendary P3 that saw Nuvolari star in his biggest endeavors. Then the AC 2900B Speciale Le Mans, one of the museum's masterpieces. The Tipo C that prevailed at the Vanderbilt Cup in 1936, and the 512. Up to the 2 impossible 2 engines monoposto. Before he became the Drake, Enzo Ferrari debuted as an Alfa Romeo driver in 1920. In 1929, he founded the Scuderia Ferrari, that soon became the Alfa Romeo's official racing department. That period brought Alfa many victories, but also extraordinary cars, which displayed the Alfa Romeo emblem on the bonnet and the prancing horse of Ferrari on the side. There were also outstanding vehicles, like the Bimotore, 2-engine, 1 engine in the front and 1 in the rear, for an overall power of 540 horsepower, and a speed record that Tazio Nuvolari set on the Firenze-Mare highway at over 350 km/h.
After the war, the world was reborn, and while Alfa Romeo was designing its futures, the Alfettas, which had been hiding to escape the bombings, come back to the tracks.
Designed in 1938, the 158 has a 1.5-liter inline 8-cylinder engine with volumetric compressor. In the beginning, it had 185 horsepower, but when the first F1 World Championship started in 1950, it has already reached 350 horsepower. Then came 11 victories on 11 races, and Nino Farina, in 1950, became the first F1 World Champion. In 1951, the car was so deeply evolved that it was renamed 159. The horsepower had soared to 450 for a maximum speed of 306 km/h. It was an intense championship, all the way to the last race, the Spanish Grand Prix, when Fangio won the World Championship with a victory that would go down in history. In the 60s, Alfa Romeo returned to the races with Carlo Chitti's Auto Delta, and the Tipo 33s returned to the Sport Championship. Created in 1967 with 2-liter engines, they soon rose to 3 liters, and in 1975 and 1977 they won 2 World Championships for sport vehicles. But the true masterpiece of the project is the 33 Stradale, which, as its name indicates, was a car conceived for the road use. Production was planned for 50 units, but it stopped at only 18 chassis, 12 of which have this streamlined body designed by Franco Scaglione, which immediately made this car one of the immortal and timeless icons of Alfa Romeo. It is a time in which different categories, cars, championship succeed each other. From the sports cars of the 50s, like the 6C 3000 CM, to those of the 60s, like the Giulia TZ2, and then the epic of the Giulia GTA and GTA-M, which in the 60s and 70s had no rivals in Super Tourism Championships. The dream of returning to Formula 1 came true in the 70s, when Alfa Romeo, first by providing its engines to the Team Brabham, and then by participating with a complete Alfa Romeo vehicle, finally returned to the top league. The cars preserved in these halls are alive and functioning. A mechanical workshop maintains them regularly, and a small internal track allows them to stretch their legs every once in a while and drive a few laps to remain strong and alive.